I'd like to introduce everyone to David McQueen. Thank you, David.
It's a pleasure, my friend. It's a pleasure. Pleasure to see you and pleasure to be here.
Awesome, awesome. I think this is quite special for me personally, because when I first met David, I was fresh-faced out of university, sitting on a panel, and David was the person sat next to me, and he was just saying some really insightful stuff. I remember having to take some notes down. Can't remember what you're saying now, but since then, you've been just a force for good. I mean, for those of you, and it's probably not the right analogy, for those of you a bit outside the scene, David is a figurehead in the community. And I will say, when I say community, I mean the unseen majority, right? So it's beyond just race. There is an unseen majority that are about. And I want to say you're kind of like a Will Smith, but I didn't want to use Will Smith because he's.
I ain't slapping anybody.
But David does so much force for good behind the scenes. In front of the scenes, he's definitely a leader. And for me, it's just been like personally, I've had some really difficult times and I've been able to just hit up Dave and say, look, I just need to talk. And he's given me some of his amazing expert executive level coaching and just lavished me with it and helped me through some really difficult times. So I appreciate that, David. I really do.
All good, man. It's all good. It's a pleasure. It's absolutely a pleasure.
Awesome. So let's get straight into it. Brave
Mhm.
leadership, your latest kind of, I don't know, your thought process on the world, your views, your perspectives, but particularly on what leadership needs to become.
Mhm.
I've read the book in the way
Good.
that I have, and there's some key things that have come out to me from it. But I think let's start at what is brave leadership? So for the person that's never heard of this concept
Mhm.
before, doesn't understand what's different about this,
Yeah.
how do you conceptualize brave leadership?
Okay. So for the context, and I'm sure you would have, people who have listened to the intro would have done their homework as well. I've done a lot of coaching over the years, and one of the biggest things that came out for me were lots of people were either thrust into the spotlight of leadership in terms of position, or even just in terms of being the function of being a leader, but they weren't really equipped as to how to make courageous decisions. And so, whether that was hiring the right person, or getting rid of somebody that wasn't fit for purpose, or having to deal with some really contentious issues that you just need to do when you're taking people on a journey, I realized a lot of people weren't as courageous as they could have been. And what I wanted to do was create a framework to at least give people the idea that they could make courageous decisions and they could do things differently. So brave not only works as a verb or as an adverb, but it also works as an acronym. And so it stands for being resilient, being agile, being visionary, and being ethical. And those five pillars for me were a kind of a guiding light or a framework for people who do find themselves in positions of leadership, whatever it is in their work. And I just wanted them to be able to go, how do I be brave in this situation? And these are the kind of pillars that they can hang their behaviors and the decisions that they can make off. So that's in essence what brave leadership is about.
Fantastic. And I mean, as I was reading it, what was speaking to me was actually what's coming through in those principles or those guiding principles are almost characteristics that I've seen in you, right, over the years. And so one of my questions was, if you can take it back to your childhood, did you see times that you were formative in you having to develop your own bravery or,
Yeah.
how you had to navigate the world? What did
Yes.
that look like for your own experience?
No, definitely. So my parents are, I call them, they're expats from the Caribbean. I don't say migrants because they came here with a passport, right? So they're expats from the Caribbean. And having to navigate 1960s Britain,
Mm.
and I was born in 1969, so I just made it at the end of that decade into the 70s. Watching them navigate that, it took a lot of courage.
Mm.
You're talking about these young, I think my parents came here when they were 19 and 20, left their family, and they're the only ones that kind of came from their family to be here. And having to navigate that space while still keeping a sense of integrity really encouraged me. And so I grew up in a church tradition where, we sang, we recited scripture, we were able to go and be encouraged to just talk with our full chest from quite young. Some of the messages that came in there, they taught us because, we taught we had to be twice as good and all those kind of
Right.
bad maths kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
But it was important to have that kind of nurturing. And so from quite young, I was never afraid to be in a room with adults. I was never afraid if I was to be put on a stage to be able to speak and to be able to communicate in a way that allowed me to, yeah, to get my point across, but also to be able to, and I think I missed this when I was younger, but I got it when I was a bit older, but being able to not only speak so that people will listen, but in turn being able to listen when other people spoke as well.
Mm.
That was actually quite, I learned that a lot later in my life, but that was actually quite a powerful part of the communication triangle. And so being brought up in that tradition of, very professional Caribbean individuals who, I know people who were doctors and lawyers. I remember there's a guy who worked for the World Bank, which absolutely fascinated me when I was growing up in my teens, because you just didn't see that. You had entrepreneurs, you had engineers, and I was surrounded by these very ambitious and very spiritual individuals who were, in many respects, quite fearless in the way they approached their work. And so that rubbed off. That definitely rubbed off on me. And then when you add all the other parts to it, the creative, the sports, the fact that we were part of a community that every now and then we would take coach trips outside of London and we'd go out into the country and we'd go camping. All those kinds of things gave me a real sense of adventure. And it tapped into this, into this courage. Because even though to be fair, my parents are a bit more, they weren't as adventurous. They were kind of like a bit more cautious. And I understand because, when they came here, you had to be very mindful about where you were going. But there was a real sense of adventure that being in that environment really left within me, that there were possibilities around what I could do with my life. And it's just stayed part and parcel of the course. It's just been with me since I've young all the way till now.
Wow. And so you, I guess with this book, you was trying to conceptualize what that was, that essence almost.
Yes. Yeah.
How have you seen it shown up in other leaders? And also where have you seen, I guess where I want to go with this is like where other leaders have tried to access this and not been able to. Like some of the big barriers.
Yeah. So one of the things that really sparked this off for me and really, really inspired me to do this book was in early 2019. I was doing some leadership work with a number of companies, and they were really stuck dealing with two issues. One around the issue of Me Too, so all the sexual discrimination that was happening with women. And they wanted somebody to come in and do some communication and coaching skills with a number of senior leaders around how they can navigate that, because a lot of people were moving from fear rather than a place of strength. And the second one for me is that people were beginning to call me in to do some work tangentially to diversity programs. And even though I always said to people, look, I'm not a diversity expert, let me just keep it 100. What I can do is I can speak to how, as a leader, we make sense of the world around us. And based on that sense making, we start to solve problems. And then the third pillar to that is then we can start to make decisions, which leads to action as a result of understanding that sense of the world. And going in and working with a number of companies and really not just running workshops, but coaching and facilitating people and asking difficult questions and saying to people, it's all right to be uncomfortable. No one's going to cuss you out or cancel you or shut you down because you said something wrong. We're going to create an environment where, rather than it just being a safe space, which a lot of people talk about, this is going to be a brave space. So you are going to be able to be emotionally aware of other people, but I also want you to be emotionally aware of yourself and realize where there are elements of weakness there are elements of uncertainty which don't make you weak, but it might feel like weakness to you. I want to be able to convert it into strength. And then obviously 2020 came along, COVID hit, Black Lives Matter came along, and that just escalated it to another level. And again, for me, there were so many things that were driven by fear, people's reaction to, and even now, if we're thinking about in the modern era, we got the elections coming up in the UK and US in 2024, which obviously will tap into a lot of fears that people have about how do we thrive or survive in this space. We've got the ongoing conflicts in places like Congo, Israel and Palestine, and other areas where people are too afraid to talk out about things. And I go, no, we can create a space to talk. It may not be in the public sphere, but we can actually create that space. And so it really tapped into my desire to say, we can have a conversation about this. If we can agree what the ground rules are, if we can have a sense of consensus around the fact that no one here is trying to win an argument or, bat somebody else down, but rather really explore what's the solution that we can get to where everybody wins.
Right.
We can do that if we're a lot more courageous around doing it. And that's why, for example, I don't get involved in toing and froing. For example, I just said to you before around Israel and Palestine, because it's not a binary situation. It's not an either or them and us. It's rather how with this historical implication of what's actually happened in the Levant, how do we get to a space where everybody wins rather than it just being one or the other? And so bravery for me in this space, and why I'm so excited about being in this arena, is it gives me an opportunity to not only challenge individuals around not being afraid and giving themselves a sense of agency and understanding what collective resilience looks like and being flexible enough to change your ideas, even if they may disagree with something that you've grown up with or you're used to, and to do it with a sense of ethics as well. But it also, for me, gives a great opportunity for people to challenge me. I love it. And sometimes people make apologies. They're like, I'm sorry, I disagree with you. I'm like, why are you apologizing? Just disagree. It's absolutely fine if you do it with respect and if you do it with the space or the context that we've created in this room, that's absolutely fine. And I just want people to be a bit more braver rather than retreating and feeling that if they don't go down this route, then everything collapses.
Right.
You know,
Right.
just to be able to have the option to think slightly differently. If that makes sense.
It's a really powerful kind of concept, because immediately when I started to really delve into the book, what
Mhm.
became apparent is, oh snap, what have we got at the moment? And what it feels like we got at the moment is a lot of fear-based leadership, right?
Yes.
Like even if we take it all the way up to government,
Yeah.
it's a lot of, if we don't say this or we don't do this, then we're going to
Mhm.
lose votes, which is
Yes.
at the heart of it, fear-driven, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
the rest of it. So, because I think as leaders, everything is like on fire sometimes, and there's
Yeah.
always problems.
Yes.
How do we begin to, and I know there's a section in there about embracing failure, but
Yes.
how do we start to really confront our fears, I guess?
Yeah. I think, and I strongly believe that a big part of this is how we do it together.
Okay.
But very often there is an emphasis placed by some people on this whole idea of what's it called? What's it called now? The great man. And
Mm.
the great man is this, individual person who can really go in and save the day. They ride in on their horse and they just make things, a lot better in the way that they are able to navigate the world. And unfortunately, too many of those examples of leadership copied and are modeled in the workplace, in education, in healthcare, in the community. Whereas for me, I believe that leadership is distributed and that there are going to be, depending on the environment or culture you're in, there are going to be hierarchies. There
Mm.
are going to be individuals because of a cultural referencing or framing who are going to defer to certain people who are older or who may have a taller, deeper voice or what have you, the loudest person in the room. And for me, it's about taking a step back from that and going, okay, and how has that helped us in the past? And
Mm.
how has that made it sustainable for us to be able to do something? Because if you rip that person out, that great man or that great woman out of the actual equation,
Right.
what happens to the individuals that are there who are left
Yeah.
behind?
Yeah. Yeah.
I see that in football. You have this great football manager comes in, swivels the world around, the club's the best thing in the world. And then all of a sudden that person's gone and everybody starts to panic because the sense of leadership is not a continuum, but it's just dependent on that one or two people being in there. And so, in a really kind of ever-changing world, there's a phrase, I can't remember if I've mentioned it in the book now. If I haven't, then can forgive me or you can remind me. But a lot of people talk about this VUCA model, which is basically VUCA, which means volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And it started out in the army, and it was just basically a model that people used in order to say that they don't necessarily understand the world.
Mm.
And so they looked and they were like, it's volatile. So how to react to this? And I remember reading just before I published the book, I came across another model, which was called the BANI or Barney model. It basically says, we're living in a world which is very brittle. People are anxious. It's non-linear. And for a lot of people, it's incomprehensible. They really just don't understand it. And what I realized is that so much of that can be just shaped in pessimism. And for me, I felt that even though the world is sometimes in a state of chaos, if you think about, use this model in the book because I was trying to keep it small, right? But if you think about the fire service, for example,
Yeah.
if you think about a fire that happens, for anybody who doesn't who isn't trained as a fire person, that looks chaotic when you look at it. You just see flames, you just see a building coming, you order, windows and all the rest of it. But individuals who are firefighters are trained to understand, how do we make sure that we don't feed the flames? How do we make sure that we create the area safe? What is it that we work through? And what they end up doing, regardless of what actually happens, is understanding, how chaotic is this situation right in front of us? And how do we manage it? And you can't put out a fire unless you've done the kind of practice from before.
Right.
And so for me, this is where that whole boldness and resilience comes in again in the model, where you go, okay, what structures do we have in place to make us robust? Or as I mentioned in the book, to make us anti-fragile, so that instead of just being brittle, we have ways of being able to bounce back. And I think of in whether it's in education or healthcare or local councils, which across the UK I've seen being really hit by a lack of funding, or the signature events like Brexit, meaning that we get less foreign students coming in from the EU or other places. So the money that was kind of like really bolstering or keeping a lot of these organizations alive, it really reduces. So you had to shift, because there are a lot of students who just didn't want to go to university from the UK. So how then do you adapt? And adapting in those situations sometimes mean you have to take drastic measures. Sometimes it might mean the reduction and removal of a department. Sometimes it might mean the reduction and removal of headcount. And a lot of people are really afraid of, oh my God, if I go in there and I do these things, am I going to offend people? And the truth is, you have no real control over whether you offend somebody or not. Somebody's going to get offended anyway. You control whether you say something offensive, which is very different, but you can't really control over people being offended or not. And so building into that system the ability to go, all right, if we do lose funding, or if our scholarships are totally reduced, or if we have to kind of do, and I know this happened in education, where a lot of secondary schools, for example, had to close down their schools because the way that they were built many years ago meant that they were inferior, and these classes could fall in and injure children, which is even more dangerous in the long term. So the question is, if we take a step back from this, what are the options that we have? And I mentioned it earlier, how do we make sense of this world around us?
Right.
So many people miss that. They are just reacting rather than responding. And that reaction for me is that kind of fight or flight thing, whereas a responsible bit is go, all right, let's make sense of this. What are the scenarios that we can work with that will really help us? And whilst we're doing this, and this goes to the core of the brave leadership, is when you're making that decision, how inclusive can we be for all the stakeholders that we're working with?
Yeah.
So what does it look like across the board for everybody who are involved with, whether it's a customer, a client, the community, whatever it is that we're working with? How do we make sense of this? And then when we make sense of it, then really start to consider, okay, we've got to be able to solve this problem. What are the brave options that we have in front of us? Some may be drastic, some may be less drastic, but we have to make those brave choices. And then finally, whilst we're doing that solving, then we go, okay, what are those decisions that we're going to make that are going to make a massive difference? And rather than just thinking of it, and we've only got to think about how this may respond for the next election cycle or the next series of budgets that come through, there is something around being quite visionary, which is another part of the model, going, what does this look like if we do a really good job now in this year, that we can look back in 5-10 years time to know that we did something that would allow this organization to be sustainable and robust. So for me, it's really taking that step back, not having a knee-jerk reaction, not thinking that we have to solve everything now, but really taking those moments to go, all right, if we're going to have a really honest and courageous conversation, this is going to be bloody hard. This is going to be tough work. This may result in some casualties along the way, but let's be really firm about being honest around what we have to do, thinking about a way that we have to communicate that honesty to all the stakeholders so everybody's fully aware of it, and then to be able to push ahead. I could nerd out on this all day long, sir, but
yeah. As you were speaking, there was two concepts, actually three, in the book that I did want to ask you about. So you had put forward that you view inclusive leadership as a system.
Yes.
Not as, an individual's, decision making or whatnot, but actually as a system. So I'll just hold that in mind. But you also brought out chapter 6, I just have to take this quote. You said, the brave leader is unapologetic about centering inclusion. And I thought that was quite powerful, the centering of So we're holding, so just for the viewers and those listening, youth leadership is a system. It's thinking, inclusion. And
Yeah.
then this last piece was from Peter Seng's work.
Mhm.
And he put a quote out, and I think you said this was the definition that you most ascribe to. The capacity of a human community, leadership is
Mhm.
the capacity of a human community to shape its future.
Yes.
So taking those three concepts,
Mhm.
system, inclusion,
Mhm.
and this almost this collective moving in a direction, for you, I mean, when we're talking about dealing with issues, things that come up, and I know we've got the framework of Brave, but how does that collaboration look like in practice? What kind of ways do you actually see all those things coming together in leadership?
So again, if because I know we've had loads of conversations in the context of education. Let's take that for example. So so much of the, I'd say the higher education, the way higher education is shaped in the UK is very hierarchical, right? You've got the Russell Group kind of, well, you got Oxbridge right at the top, right? And then you've got the other kind of Russell Group that come underneath, and then you've got everybody else that kind of filters down.
Mm.
And so what's actually happened is you have all these organizations who have been encouraged to be in competition with each other all the time. So you're fighting for seats, you're fighting for bums on seats so that you can, justify the kind of, the funding or the scholarships or all the other stuff that comes alongside it. Not only are you doing that, but then you are in league in competition with those who are really heavily funded because they do a lot of stuff around research. And again, depending on who are the donors or the trustees or what have you. And the danger in that for me is that all these things tend to happen in isolation.
Mm.
And don't get me wrong, I have got no truck with the fact that there is going to be a competitive spirit. That's part of our human nature, it's part of evolution. Like we are going to always be competitive. But it often feels like a race to the bottom as opposed to robust ways of being able to strengthen and encourage each other.
Right.
And so for me, systemic leadership is around how then do we understand what we're doing really well in our domain, but what are the bits that we can actually share with others that can help them as well? So, for example, Oxford University is under no threat from South Bank University,
Mhm.
just in terms of the attraction of individuals around the world trying to get into that university. And what I find quite curious is very well, I'm sure it probably happens somewhere, but never do you see in a public arena the conversation between, say, the dean or vice chair of, or whatever of Oxford, having this conversation with the dean or chair of South Bank around understanding what best practice looks like. Understanding while South Bank is not a research university, what are the kind of like keys and principles that they can learn that can help with the efficacy of the way that students are taught there,
Mm.
retention or what have you. And so the systemic leadership for me is not only what actually happens within your organization, but how does it happen as a whole ecosystem?
Right.
How does it make sure that you are saying Oxbridge is great, but how do we make sure that all the universities in the UK make us one of the best places to go and study in the whole world? And very often those conversations don't actually happen. And part of it is because people aren't inclusive, because they love to be able to be in their fiefdom. They love to be able to be within their little silos. And that's historic, right? That's happened over years. If people have told you that you're the best and there's a sense of elitism that comes with that, people want to protect that at all costs.
Mm.
Whether they are graduates who have kind of like gone back and, been part of the alumni and funding it to keep that connection, which at the top end, but less so down at the, at the less funded universities. And inclusion for me is not just around protected characteristics, as you know. It's not just around race, ethnicity, orientation, disability. Those for me are part and parcel of it. But inclusion is around how do we make our decisions in light of that systemic leadership? How do we make our decisions in light of education as a whole? And then it comes back to that last point you made by Peter Senge, just, so how do we collectively move people to this space?
Mm.
And it's very easy to, get into conspiracy theories or arguments around, the powerful elite. They make sure that they keep the poorer down at the bottom, all the rest of it. People will always make complaints about an education system, but I go, but what contribution do we make? I know as a parent, I always say to a lot of younger parents, when you go to a school, don't just accept when a teacher says to you and a parent, even your child is doing well, and and they're doing well and they're hitting target. Find out, how is their mind being stretched? How are you teaching that this is relevant to the world that they're around them? What is it that we can do as parents to be able to contribute to the learning, and obviously being able to have a coherent discussion around behavior and making that young person being a really good citizen? And that then taps into us being able to move towards it being collective.
Yeah.
And I believe one of the challenges that we have, especially here in the UK, is that we are quite individualist, very much like Northern Europe and the USA. It's very much about ourselves. Whereas sometimes when we look at other spaces in the global south, give or take their good or bad points, it's very collective. It's very much around how do we get there together. Right. And so to your point around the practical challenges, it is about being able to go, let me park my ego for a moment and let's see how this looks like in the bigger scheme of things. Let's take, I'm pretending like I know what I'm talking about because I was in there years ago, right? But let's take HEFKI, for instance.
They've changed name, so it's the OFS, Office for Students.
See, okay. So what was HEFKI, which is now the OFS? You see, this shows you how long I've been out of the game, right? But let's just take the OFS for example. There's a standard, there's an understanding, there is a collaboration between organizations to capture data, to capture metrics, to understand how this thing works. If that kind of organization can really well with the collaboration of all the inputs from all those different universities, then surely that can work around other areas, around governance, around leadership, around sustaining and recognizing, look, in some situations, some universities are not fit for purpose. Right. And whilst it may be a constraint on somebody because they may have to travel slightly longer to go to another one, sometimes that's the way it has to be in order for it to be able to be sustainable. And just because you, for example, change from a polytechnic to university, or even if you're a university with falling numbers, that historically has been one, history doesn't determine whether or not you should stay right here in the present and should build for the future. So for me, a lot of it is around collaboration. It's around sharing that information. It's about making sense of the world around you. And we're filled, again, whether it's in education, in the corporate space, in council, whatever, we're filled with enough individuals in those spaces who are truly educated, who have got the examinations, who have got all the pieces of paper and the letters behind their name, which are longer than the ones that are in front that make up their actual name. And being able to come together and go, okay, how do we be really courageous about this and not just do it for ourselves right now, just so that, we get the MBE or whatever kind of certification that will make us feel all good. But what does this look like now to invest in this so that a generation that comes behind us can benefit from the decisions that we've made in the here and now? And that for me is the practical stuff. That's where you get individuals going, let's meet, let's have these symposiums, let's have this conversation, let's be very intentional about the leadership, not only internally within our organization, but externally as well, and park that ego for a bit.
Yeah. And that, I guess that's what comes out of this center and inclusion, right, and not apologizing for it.
Yeah.
One of the practical elements that came out of for me was this mapping talent journeys.
Yes.
I hadn't really heard about. I mean, I've heard about staff development and CPD, but this felt very intentional.
Yes.
And individualized. Just, I mean, high level. What's your thoughts about that mapping of talent journeys and maybe in light of inclusion and difference?
Yeah. So one of the things I loved when, again, even when I was researching this book, Nathan, I nerded out, like properly nerded out on organizational theory and leadership development. I referenced a few of the books in the glossary, but there was so much more that I nerded out. And I was like, no, I don't want this to be too highbrow that people don't get it. But when you have an organization, one of the things I found in my journey is that a lot of people didn't map out. What does it look like if you may go into an organization and your journey might only be 2 years, but how do I map out that journey in such a way that you get the maximum benefit of it as an individual? So you get those opportunities that will develop you, not just in terms of title, because a lot of people get really hung up in title, but rather what's the output? What's the impact that you want to have as an individual in that space? And very often, when you think about talent, people are only thinking of it in a linear way of, right, you've come in and you're going to work your way up to the CEO or the chairman. Now, the truth is that we know in organizations, it is like a pyramid, right? The higher up you get in terms of that seniority or leadership, the less space there is up there. You get the massive amount at grassroots level, but the more you go to those senior executive roles, the less it is. So it becomes highly competitive and not everybody's going to win. Yeah. However, being able to frame it in such a way to go, what's the talent that we have in here? And what's a way of being able to go, I really need to be able to tap into this. I really need to be able to manage this in the best way possible. And again, depending on where you are, mapping talent in a corporate is going to be very different than how you map it in a public institution or in a non-profit. But the same principles apply where you go, right, this is the talent that I have. These are the skills that we have. These are the leadership competencies that we have. This is what we have here. And there may be some times where somebody, again, may be here for the long run.
Sorry to cut you, just to make it clear, because for those who haven't read the book, and I hope I'm not giving your book away for
No,
free.
that's fine. It's absolutely fine. Don't worry. Don't worry.
What you was talking about was an audit. To
Yeah.
start with an audit.
Yeah.
Before doing anything.
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Go ahead.
But people are afraid of that, right? Because it sounds too accounty.
Right.
So sometimes when people see that, they look and they're like, "Oh, that sounds a bit more. That sounds a bit much like accounting."
Yeah.
But, there's something around, and even if people don't want to call it an audit, let's change it to a health check, right? Or an MOT. We don't drive our cars down the road here in the UK without an MOT.
Right.
If I think about our healthcare system, I truly believe that at the moment what we have is a sick care system where individuals can go in and they can be given lots of medicines to deal with stuff. Like, don't just give me antacids and aspirins. Tell me how I can live a lifestyle where I can reduce having headaches or I can reduce having indigestion. Right. And a lot of that is when we do our MOT, so we look after ourselves to make sure it's maintained. And so that kind of health check, MOT, or the healthcare of the organization is it is a deliberate thing that might take a while to start. But if you're able to implement that so that people can see it and then you augment it as time goes over because things will change, for me, that's really important. And even now, I see lots of organizations and people reach out to me and they're like, David, I'm really terrified of the way that AI is going to come in and impact my job. I'm like, AI has been around for donkey's years. All right. Just because there are certain popular tools that are out there now that people are telling to leverage that will make you feel like it's redundant. The fact of the matter is that you still need sensible people to lead an organization. And an AI, for however you see it, is still full, like ourselves, is full of biases. Right. And so no matter what tools you've got using, you still have to understand that there are biases and things that you have to work with. So the mapping bit is really around getting people to go, what does that health check look like for me? And recognizing that there are going to be some healthy bits and there are going to be some unhealthy bits. Now, sometimes with the unhealthy bits, through coaching, through sponsorship, through mentoring, you may be able to turn that stuff around. In other situations, you may have to let that go. And it's important that people do this regularly so they have a sense, because the amount of knowledge and wisdom that leaves organizations when somebody's fed up and they decide that they're going to bounce. Yeah. Now, not everybody's going to leave an organization on a happy note, but imagine if you've got a really good, rising, high-performing individual in an organization, and they're able to share with other individuals around some of the things that they've learned. Yes, some of it is individual, but some of the principles can be shared across the board. If that person goes, of course, there's a small void, but if the principles still say, and other people can adopt that, you're not just left with this massive gap in knowledge and understanding just because this person's gone. And for me, I believe that a lot of organizations could do a lot better if they did those health checks to make sure that they were able to capture that wisdom and that knowledge and that practical application of what really actually helps that organization to thrive.
Awesome. Just on that point, and before I move on to come to a close, one of the big things that I really wanted to talk to you about is, in higher education, the data's out there, it's quite stark. There is less than, and this is data stats from Higher Education Statistics Agency, between 2014 and 2021, there's been less than 5 Black senior managers, officials, yes, office of the vice chancellor level. And we're talking, well over a decade. Yeah. And so, yes, this points to grave systematic inequality, but also, I guess a lot of my work as well, working with Black professionals and in higher education, like you said, not everyone wants to get into senior leadership. So that's a big thing. Yeah. But it's obvious that there needs to be more, and there are people that want to get to that senior leadership, right?
Yes. Yeah.
The two things that I've encountered in having conversations with people, I also do coaching on a program called Diversifying Leadership with Advanced HE. And the two things that often come up is, well, a fear, but not necessarily a fear of going into the position, but a fear of visibility.
Yeah.
So we might sometimes say, actually, just be more visible, right? And show your work. But actually, being more visible, and we've just seen with the Harvard president, where if you become more visible, you actually become more vulnerable
Yeah.
in at the same time.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to, let's just again say, the unseen majority who want to succeed in their career?
Mm.
They want to climb the ladder or even just succeed in different ways, whether getting more research or whatever it may be. Understand that there's a requirement to be more visible.
Mm.
I feel extremely uncomfortable with it. I don't want to put myself out there, for all very valid reasons to
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
judged negatively and stereotypes and so forth.
Yes.
And I'm asking this question in the context of I've seen you be very visible,
Mm.
but then also I remember reaching out to you one time, and this is when the audio app was blowing up in 2020. I think it was, what's it, Clubhouse,
Yeah.
Clubhouse. And I
Yeah.
said, Dave, you got to get onto Clubhouse. And you was like, I don't know. Let me check it out. I don't think it's my thing, right? And I was just like, oh, but Dave, you talk. I think you need to be on there.
Mhm.
How should someone navigate
Mm.
visibility
Yeah.
when they're aware of the very real judgment, stereotypes, negative associations with just them being?
So let me respond first to the Clubhouse bit. I went in and I did about 3 or 4 town halls on Clubhouse, and my resistance to it was that, like Facebook and Twitter, I think it was designed in such a way that the algorithm or the popularity was around the more contentious content more than people wanting to learn.
Right,
What
right.
I love about podcasts is that you get to control that. And so that's why I love podcasts. That's why I love having a conversation with you, because we get to get an understanding of what that is. We can disagree,
Yeah,
absolutely, but we know what that consensus is. We're not going into a space blind and having no idea whether we'll be, you know, sidetracked by somebody who's just looking to score points.
yeah.
And so the context of that is knowing where, for me, is it's knowing where to be visible.
Mm,
So, for example, I'm very visible on LinkedIn. I used to be visible on Twitter, until I realized the outrage meter was just going wild, and I pulled back and I quit. I literally left. I remember I left Twitter in 2018,
wow.
and people were like, "Really? Like, where you going?" I was like, "I'm gonna go to LinkedIn because at least I know where you work. So if you come for me, I know your bosses are coming for you." And what I realized was that I have a privilege, and I'll say that I have a privilege of being able to say the things a lot of people can't say in their places of work.
Okay.
So my visibility allows me to draw attention to some very contentious issues that I know people can only send me a message in my DMs or directly to my email because they can't do that. However, what it also affords me is an ability to then draw attention to individuals who are like, do you know what? I totally agree with you. How do we navigate that? And then that creates forums. So I run a number of dining clubs, as you probably know, where I will grab together maybe 8 to 10 or sometimes up to 12 individuals around a table, and we share best practice. I tap into individuals who have been able to thrive rather than survive in these areas. And what is it that you do? So let's take, for example, what you were saying about that lack of representation in higher education. A lot of that steeped in, if we're very honest about it, steeped in systemic racism. A lot of it is steeped in classism. And there are outliers. There are individuals that have been able to navigate that. But in some respects, some of those have been coalesced and they've been able to play that game rather than being as brave and bold as they should be. However, wherever you stay, I think there's something powerful around having what I call my board of advisors. Who are those individuals who are going to champion me, but who are going to critique me? Who are those individuals that if I get into a position of seniority, I know if I pick up the phone that I've got a senior person working in government, I've got a senior person working in the corporate area, I've got somebody working in the community who can give me a sense of balance when I'm having these conversations to go, right, okay, this is how I have to navigate X. What's your kind of thinking on how do we bounce through that? I also am a big believer, and you know this, of sponsorship. Like, I want to be in a room where I know if I speak on behalf of other people who are coming into a space, I can do that with authority, knowing that person can come and deliver it without them having to do all the heavy lifting. And so again, it's very much systemic. It's very much around how we work. I remember a couple of years back talking to the man who's now known as Lord Woolley, and him going in and getting that senior role in Homerton College in Cambridge is quite a big deal, first of many, as well as some vice chancellors. I think of Natalie Campbell down at University of Westminster. I think of, her name's gone from me now, but up in Leeds, and one down in Southampton as well. And a big part of my conversation with those individuals is, look, I'm not going to call individuals together just because they're either share the same gender or the race and ethnicity or class. What I'm looking for is there a similarity with values as well? So yes, there may be some protected characteristics, but do we share the same values? And what I feel is really important is if there's an alignment in those values, you say to individuals, okay, collectively, how can we get you here? So for me, when I think of individuals who I've mentored, coached, or sponsored to get into organizations, they don't get in there just because it's just me as a coach. They get in there because I say to them, you need a team to back you up, because leadership can be lonely if you don't have that team. So who are those individuals who we can root for, who can be there for you, who can open doors, who can make sure that on all these areas of leadership, governance, finance, self-development, and being aware, who are those individuals around you? And more, I encourage individuals who come from underrepresented or marginalized groups that when you get into those space, there are ways of doing it. And visibility does not necessarily mean that you have to be everywhere. Sometimes it just might be thought leadership. It might be you being able to write that really powerful piece and deciding for yourself, I'm only going to speak about this twice. If anybody else wants to read about it, just go and pick it up from somewhere else. It might be making it really clear to your board of governors or your board of trustees, I will be visible for these events because that's part and parcel of my role. I've got to be there for the graduation. I've got to be there for the ceremony. I've got to be there when we're talking to our funders and our trustees. But there are other ones where you're not going to see me jump on a television if there's a crisis, because that might not be my strength. Let me go and get somebody who's better at media training or who's really equipped to be able to do that. And I don't like the phrase staying in your lane, but I'm going to lean to it. There are times where you have to know what your strength is, what your lane is. And then, all leadership is about being able to empower other individuals who can operate outside of your zone of genius or in another lane, and they can go and represent on behalf of you. But for me, visibility doesn't always mean that you have to be seen. Sometimes it's about being heard as well, or even sometimes people being able to pick up on the information that you send out. And it's a careful balancing out. It's always going to be contextual. But for me, I don't think it's done on your own. You've got to be part of a system and just learn from the people who have been there before and who've done it really well.
100%, 100%. So I think we'll bring it to a close. My last question, though, and it's quite a real question, because I think people often from the unseen majority who are in organizations, their own corporations, experience what we now know to be trauma. And that might be racialized or gender-based or whatever it may be. But where they go through these really visceral experiences that just make them feel it's time to exit or they need to leave. And the more and more people that I'll be speaking to, I realize the experience of these traumatic experiences are increasing for whatever reasons. Maybe it's the external pressures and the rest of it.
Yeah.
And I'm asking this because I know you've gone through some really traumatic challenges in your own life. What are some of the key tenets that have helped you bounce back, or at least just to keep stable in what seems to be a very shaky time?
Yeah.
Is there anything that you could give just as a piece of advice of anyone going through or having gone through and needing to get back on their A game?
100%. So I'll give you two answers. The first one for me is the bigger picture. What is it that I'm trying to do or trying to get to in the first place? My personal story is one where my third company, like, literally went to the wall. I had to sell my house, had to start all over again, rented. Took me 18 years to get back onto the actual property ladder because I sent my girls to private school, did all those kind of stuff, which is absolutely fine by me. The bigger picture there for me was, how do I get my girls out into the world as stable adults, understanding how they can navigate the world as best as possible as young women? That was more important to me than having a mortgage. And so while I was doing my work, yes, I was like, oh, I would have loved to have been back on the property ladder. Let me go for house number 3. But I had to bide my time. And now I have a lovely house, but I also have two amazing young ladies who are out there doing their part in the world. One just about to graduate, one doing kicking ass down in TV and film. And so for me, the bigger picture was around the family. And
Right.
the bigger picture was around also learning how I can adapt. And look, if I was able to build a successful company, which obviously went to the wall, but it was successful when it was doing really well, then surely I could come back and do that again. What were the things that I had in place? So the second bit that comes around with that big picture is who's the community that I need around me to help me to support that bigger picture, as well as me supporting them with their bigger picture. So being clear around what my goals were and what my ambitions were and where I wanted to go to was first and foremost important. But then I had to think about who's that community that's around me that's going to allow me to be there. So let's just say, for example, I remember when you first started out and you were doing your stuff in education, for me, I felt I was part of your gang. Like when you pick up the phone and you call me, I'm like, bro, just call me. Just
Yeah.
let me know. And when you go to me like, Dave, can we talk about fees? And I'm like, bro, God damn, man, go get your money, go get your reparations, go get all your stuff right. And I'm saying it. And even though I will say it with a um being quite blasé about it, I say it because I'm like, I really want to push you in outside of your comfort zone into a growth zone, not a discomfort zone, but a growth zone where you see what's capable, what's possible for you to do that. And so for me, I'm part of that. I see myself as part of that bigger community that you have in being able to realize your dreams, for the work that you do in order to be able to change lives, the example that you leave for your family and your friends. For me, that's all important. So even when you're going through those rocky bits and when it's tough, sometimes, and I say this and I see it all the time, sometimes people are really reluctant to ask for help. So as part of what I do is I tell people, long before you need help, I'm going to kick your ass if you don't pick up the phone. I will harass you. I will literally, if I'm part of your team, right, I'm properly haranguing you and saying, come on, you need to go and do this. Because sometimes when you don't feel motivated to do it, why would you pick up the phone when you're in that space? And the big thing for me is that community piece around how do I encourage myself to go for that bigger picture? How do I encourage others in my community to keep me focused on that system? Not just motivation, because motivation can go, but what's the system that is able to get me there? And then how can I reciprocate to those people in my community to help them to get to that space?
Yeah, 100%. Awesome. Thank you so much, Dave. This has been an insightful cast episode. Lots there. As I said, everyone who's listening to me, if you listen to me on Spotify, go and get the Brave Leaders Leadership book. Dave, have you got a copy there just to flash out for those who are watching on video? That's how it looks. The Brave Leader. Get a copy for yourself, get a copy for your boss or your manager. If you're in a higher education space, it could be some great group reading with your leadership team. Definitely advise it. Dave, how can people find you if they want to get in contact with you, want to talk to you more, bring you in to speak? You
Yes.
might have to start with your fees though.
Listen, I got some free content that people can get to.
Okay.
But so davidmcqueen.co.uk. And again, a lot of my free content's on there, my podcasts, my newsletter, the articles that I write, and then obviously the more premium side of me speaking and coaching afterwards. Or people can just follow me on LinkedIn at Mr. David McQueen, I think is the kind of like linkedin.com, and then for Mr. because I'm older now, I'm in my 50s, so you have to call me by Mr. But those are the two spaces that people can find me online. So davidmcqueen.co.uk or Mr. David McQueen on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dave.
No, real
Appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Real pleasure. Thank you.
All the best. All right then. Bye-bye.